Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest, Nick Bloom, who's a professor at Stanford University. Nick, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on.
So Nick, let me ask you, let's just start right at the top. A topic I believe you know a fair amount about is, what is the future of remote work in this country?
Yes, I mean, to put it in context, I've been working on this for 20 years. So, to give you some long perspective, the future is, well, let's go back to what we've been through to kind of set the scene. So we have data going on remote work share in the US, going back to the mid 60s. It did exist in the 60s. It was 0.5% of days worked, pretty rare, but people occasionally work from home, very rarely. It was rising and rising and rising. It reached 5% in 2019. So let's go back to the last year before the pandemic. 1 in 20 full paid days was from home. Who was doing that? A few full remote workers and a few people that took the odd Friday work from home.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you hit March, April, May 2020. Anyone that could work from home was doing it, hit 60%. So probably everyone listening was probably working from home full time. Basically all grads, professionals, managers were all fully remote. Where we are now, and this looks like kind of we're now in the long run steady state, is about 30% of days. Where does that come from? There's kind of two groups that make that up. One is folks that are fully remote. That's about 15% of people. Most people think that's like Airbnb or high-end coders, so some, but mostly these people are actually payroll processing, call centers, IT support, mostly by headcount, then they're kind of mid-level skills. The other 15% comes from probably your listeners, folks like me and you, who are working hybrid. So the typical, think of, grad, MBA, professional manager is coming into the office about 2 to 3 days a week and working at home 2 to 3 days a week. And so, there's two groups, fully remote and hybrid workers.
So you think we've reached the steady state, or what do you think? Or do you think, or is it going to go back, which direction is it going?
Well, I think it's like a Nike swoosh. So right now, to date us, we're October 2022. We're kind of, approaching the low point. It is falling. It's 30% now. It might fall to its very lowest at maybe 25%. I doubt it'll ever get that low. Why is that? It's because as the recession hits, there are a bunch of firms, to be honest, particularly larger ones with kind of older managers that are, in their 60 plus, tend to be, I had my career in the office 5 days a week. I want my folks back. They'll have some success in pushing for a bit more of a return, but not that much. I should note that Labor Day, there's a big push for return to the office post Labor Day. And if you look at the data, it picked up a bit, but pretty little. So maybe drop 25%. Long run, the swoosh is it will pick back up again, because there are two big factors driving the long run that, these unstoppable forces.
Yeah.
One is technology. So, me and you are talking now over Zoom. I was actually in Zoom last week talking to Eric Yuan. This is a company that was founded in 2011. If you think of going back a mere 10 years, or certainly 15 years or 20 years when I started working on work from home, it was way worse. It was like telephone calls, emailing files, sending floppies through the mail. I mean, it was just horrible. You go back 40 years, I was a kid when my parents were working from home a bit. It was shuffling pieces of paper. So tech is a big driver. And the pace of tech has picked up massively because the market's grown. So, Econ 101, if the number of people working from home has gone up 6-fold, which it has basically from pre to post pandemic, every hardware and software firm out there is suddenly shoveling millions, billions of dollars of R&D into making work from home better. So it's hard to predict like what technology, but for sure within 5 or 10 years, we'll have, way better laptops. You have like laptops with massive screens with multiple cameras. So whenever you look at any box on Zoom, you appear to be looking into their eyes, or maybe have holograms, AR, virtual reality, metaverse, blah, blah, bblah. So technology is one. The other thing that's really interesting, I was actually having lunch with Hayden Brown. So she's the CEO of Upwork last week as well, and talking to her, and she was saying something that I've noticed as well, and we're collecting data on it, which is post-pandemic, just about every startup that has moved to fully remote. So we've got a whole cohort of young firms that are now operating fully remote. Like, my neighbor over the back fence, Niels, he has a startup and he's fully remote. And he's like, everyone I know is fully remote that can. And what that means is as time goes on, these startups grow and mature. and become a bigger and bigger share of employment, many of them are just going to stick with it. They're just never going to get that first office. If they do, it'll be a lot later.
Right.
So, the swoosh is like, we're at the low point now for post-pandemic, 30%. Maybe 6 months from now, we'll be a little lower. 2 years from now, we'll be at least the level we are. 5 years from now, for sure, work from home is going to be harder than it is now. And 10 years from now, we're going to look back and think, oh my God, 2022, it was so bad. It was like, how did we put up with that? I can't believe people only work from home 2 days a week. So.
Yeah. Well, the other force, I think that I like the fact that you talked about these forces, because you can't stop technology development. You can't stop, these new startups. But the other force is that the people that are, trying to go back to the office are the older generation, right? They're the ones that grew up in an office, and they're going to retire and move on. So again, and you can't reverse that. So they're not getting younger; they're going to get older, and so and the newer generation, they're just going to be used to working from remote. I totally agree with that. What is your area of research exactly? I mean, it sounds like you've actually been studying this, but what are you researching exactly?
Well, it's a good question. So I actually have three main areas of research. My PhD was on measuring uncertainty. So some listeners have maybe used some of the data I've created. I have something called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. It's used a lot by banks and hedge funds. It's carried by Bloomberg, etc. I have a totally different research agenda on management. Long ago, I worked in McKinsey. I mean, this is going back 20-something years, more than 20 years, and got really interested in management practices. And a little bit of that was what I'll call kind of being nice to people practices. Like my wife, we had kids in the UK, and she went through maternity leave from different employers. And I noticed they varied a lot. And I was like, look, maybe there's a good and a bad practice here. And things like working from home, part-time job sharing, etc. So I worked on that a bit. I was very fortunate that I had a student in Stanford called James Liang, who was the co-founding CEO of Trip.com, like one of the world's big three travel agencies, worth, I don't know, $5-10 billion on NASDAQ. It's a massive company. He was in my class in Stanford, and I ended up doing a randomized control trial. I've now run two of them actually on work from home, a Trip, whereby you take large groups of people and you randomize them on even and odd birthdays. They're all volunteers. So in the first experiment, half of them were remote 4 days a week. And in the second experiment, half of them were remote 2 days a week. And you measure them. And what you found, in short, is, dramatic improvement in productivity and performance. So I would say the work from home stuff pre-pandemic was not a big share of my research, 5% maybe. Since March 2020, I have maybe spent 2/3 of my time in it. A lot of it is just collecting data, trying to figure out what's going on, what works, what doesn't, talking to a ton of organizations, not just firms, but like my local city council, my local hospital, my school board, the world, the World Food Program, the RMA, all kinds of different things.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, not to make light of the pandemic, but I mean, it sounds like that's kind of the best thing that could happen given the area that you were studying, isn't it? I mean, it forced an experiment that you could never have created, right? I mean, basically, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I have mixed feelings for sure. We had some, personally quite bad outcomes in my family from this. But yeah, in terms of research, it was. Work from home suddenly became hugely important. I mean, interesting thing is, I remember I gave a TEDx talk on work from home in 2017, and the woman that was helping me, she was, kind of preparing me for the talk, said, you've got to sell it a bit. You're like such an academic, you so undersell it. And so at that point, my next door neighbor was Sebastian Thrun, who was one of the key people for the driverless car. And I'd seen him give a great talk on work from home on TEDx. So I said, I could compare it to the driverless car. And she's like, yeah, that's great. That's a really big deal. So I mentioned this in the TEDx talk, and, there was a lot of laughter in the audience. Like, this guy has to be joking. I mean, like, the driverless car is a big deal. Nobody cares about work from home. And you're right that the pandemic, I mean, the driverless car is fantastic, and eventually it's going to be everywhere, but it's going to be held up by regulation more than actually the technology. But yeah, work from home, my research pre-pandemic was pretty in favor of it, but it's hard to, know how much is just one experiment or one survey or one company. Yeah. The pandemic made it very clear that, look, fully remote doesn't tend to work for most people. So, don't get me wrong, I'm not pushing for fully remote. There's some major challenges. But hybrid, which typically means work from home on Monday, Friday, actually for most professionals, most managers and most firms is a win-win. I mean, the reason it's dominated in the US is not because academics or regulators or government or the media has pushed people, is it basically makes firms more money. And anything that makes firms more money, allows them to grow faster, is going to be adopted in a capitalist economy. And work from home, the evidence is just piling up. If you get it right, improves productivity, reduces turnover, reduces labor. I mean, it's basically all good. If you Monday, Friday is the most standard plan. That well managed appears to be very helpful for firm performance.
So since you've been studying this, what surprised you the most about when everybody was forced to work at home? What did you learn, or what surprised you that you didn't appreciate before when you were talking about work from home before?
I think it surprised me as much as everyone. It just wasn't a disaster.
Yeah, right.
To be quite honest, before the pandemic, there's various ways to look at it. It used to be the phrase working from home, shirking from home, or working remotely working. I used to, in presentations actually, as a kind of a gimmick on my first slide, show it doesn't work anymore because the images have changed. But in 2017, 2018, 2010, whatever, you put in the word work from home and go to Google image search and press go. It was terrible. It was like loads of naked people, cartoons, people juggling babies. It was, Homer Simpson, someone in a jacuzzi, really bad images. Right. You do it now, anyone goes to try it now, it's lots of, professionals looking pretty slick and getting on with stuff. So the pandemic, the biggest single change for me, for everyone, is, look, this thing works. It definitely isn't perfect. I'm not claiming that we do. I mean, just to be clear, half of the US labor force can't work remotely. If you work in retail, manufacturing, a lot of frontline jobs, you can't do it. But for the other half of us, it seems to work better, at least, to be at home 1-2 days a week than to be in the office full time. And that is a massive revelation. To put it in context, probably the single largest change to the US labor market before that was probably World War II, when you saw a big increase in working women, and people suddenly realized women can do well just as well. Go through your mind back to 1939, women were basically prevented from working, and suddenly turns out they can completely replicate everything men can do, and suddenly the economy is like, okay, we just doubled our labor force. So that was a huge change. Work from home is another revelation that we could have been doing this for years before. We missed it. We made a mistake. At least let's get it right going forward.
So what about things like culture, corporate culture? I mean, your neighbor started this remote company. He will never have an office building. What are you must talk to a ton of people about this. I mean, is that because I hear that's the thing that companies will lose, is not the inability to create a corporate culture. What is your thoughts about that?
Sure. So this is why fully remote and hybrid are just totally different. So just to go through it. So fully remote, whereby people never go into the office, they work from home 5 days a week, has a couple of massive upsides, but you're right, has some major downsides. There's two huge upsides. Well, a bunch of tech companies, but honestly, pretty much only tech companies and startups are doing this, is it saves an office space a lot, and it makes it easier to hire. So if you're Airbnb, you save about 20% getting rid of all your offices, or a lot of them, and you can hire globally. The massive downsides are mentoring. It's much harder to mentor people remotely. I spoke to David Solomon for Goldman Sachs, who's pushing for a pretty heavy return, and his big thing was mentoring. B, creativity. It seems to, there's a nice paper in Nature actually by one of my colleagues at Stanford on this. It's harder to innovate and be creative if you're fully remote, it seems. And then C, there's a lot on culture. If you go to hybrid's like have your cake and eat it if it's well organized. So just to be clear, the classic hybrid plan is you work from home Monday, Friday. You come into the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. An example is Lazard's, the investment bank. I was talking to you yesterday about that. They're doing this and it's working pretty well. What it means is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you have lots of in-person events, presentations, meetings, trainings, lunches, client events. You have 3 days of like intense culture. At the end of that, you're like, I don't want to talk to anyone anymore. I'm like so done with like socializing. You get it in, you pack it all into 3 days very efficiently. You build all your connections, all your in-person time, your mentoring. And then all that kind of quiet stuff, reading, writing, emails, data work, expense reports, preparing presentations, maybe one-on-one. So Richard, me and you have been in the office yesterday. We can easily talk on Zoom. That kind of stuff is on Monday, Friday. And the upside of that is people save in the commute. And the data shows the average American saves about 70 minutes by working from home on commute and time getting ready. And about 30 of that they spend on working more, and 40 minutes more on leisure. But so as an employer, you gain 30 minutes straight off. And then the other benefit is quiet work is best done in a quiet place. And home is a lot quieter than the office. So for that reason, that Monday and Friday, people are actually more productive doing. So the general data is, just to put some numbers on it, if you let people hybrid work from home, they value that at about the same as a 5 to 10% pay increase versus coming in the office 5 days a week. So it's a major retention recruitment tool. And if it's well organized, it increases productivity by 3 to 5%. So, you know, if you're a firm, it's like, what's not to like? But you're correct that fully remote does have these major downsides. Hybrid remote seems like the sweet spot if you get it right.
So let me ask you about the hybrid, because I've been thinking about, I think about this topic myself. The problem I see with hybrid is that then you have to, in other words, then you can't have people who are fully remote, because then they will be at a severe disadvantage. You almost create like a second-class citizen. So that means everybody now still has to be within commutable distance. I mean, it sort of defeats some of the advantages of being fully remote. Does that make sense?
Yes, you're completely right. So I talked to like so many large companies about this over, including Stanford, my own organization. I talk to them a lot of universities. So I think the general rule is, within a team, you really want to have people on the same setup. So, because there is a real thing called presenteeism bias. So if me and you are working in the same team, you're coming in 3 days a week and I'm fully remote, you know, you can see who's going to get the promotion.
Exactly.
So team by team, you want to have uniform. Now you have a hybrid team, everyone should come in pretty much on the same days. Now, of course, that does mean you've got to live near, not as near as if you're coming in 5 days a week. And we see in the data, people are moving out to the suburbs, but you can't live easily in another city. You know, it's better than fully in person. You're correct. If you go to fully remote, you have some upsides, but there are just some massive downsides. So it's kind of like beer versus wine, if you like. Fully remote versus hybrid, there's upsides and downsides. And for most firms, for firms outside of tech and for larger firms, they generally think the downsides of fully remote are so serious they're not going to go there. But for some firms, you know, I've spoken to a bunch of firms like Airbnb, Upwork, Quora, Yelp, Automatic. These are fully remote firms, and their views is, look, the benefits outweigh the costs, and they're successful. They're doing very well. So yeah, it just seems that outside tech, it's hard to think of a large fully remote firm, and for the reasons you highlighted, culture, mentoring, innovation are tougher. The other point I should make is kind of interesting. If you look at these big fully remote tech firms, they're not like truly fully remote in the sense that they still meet in person about once every other month. So their practice, all of these firms will say, look, you're fully remote, but every other month we're going to have like a retreat. We're going to go to Albuquerque or Barcelona if in Europe or wherever it is. We're going to meet for 4 or 5 days to kind of get together. And so people still need the sporadic bonding. It's just not weekly. It's now every other month.
I also think the other observation that I've had is that I think, well, first of all, I think people were working, you know, teams were working on much more on a distributed and remote basis than they realized before the pandemic. I mean, people would be working in different offices on different teams. I mean, but people didn't think of that as remote because they were doing it from the office. But really, from a practical matter, whether they're in the office or at home, if they're in different locations, they're really working remotely. So I think a lot more of that was going on than people kind of realized before the pandemic. But as the other thing I think that was going on a lot more than people realized is, I think a lot more of the mentoring and stuff like that was also being forced to do remotely, because the reality is that people weren't hanging, you know, the interactions that people were doing within the office is not so much anymore. People are on their phones all the time, or the stuff that they talk about, I think, is more in an idealistic world, or maybe it was, 20, 30 years ago, and people really just sat around and chit chatted. I mean, even in the office, people don't really talk that much now. They just go in their office, they do their work, they're on their phone, they're in the email, so I'm not sure. I think the mentoring was having to be done either deliberately or set it up, and not so informally. I mean, what are your thoughts?
So two thoughts. One, you're right that, the interesting thing is the multi-office company, a bunch of companies have said, it's including again in Stanford, we're a big campus, that at times it's easier to coordinate across branches during the pandemic because we're all on the same footing. Yes. I remember speaking to someone early in the pandemic who's most of his firm's in Chicago, and he was in London. He said, suddenly I feel much more connected because, I'm on the same Zoom as everyone else. I'm on the same size box. So in a weird way, there's that old Thomas Friedman book, The World is Flat, and that was never really true. And, it's still not true now, but it's become a bit flatter in the sense that distance matters less in some ways, a lot less of everyone's on Zoom, although there's still time zones. On mentoring, Yes, although there's still definitely some benefits. If you go into like a lot of firms, I've been into a lot of tech campuses recently in banks, and they have the canteens, and yeah, there's more phone use, but if you walk in, the canteens are lively and buzzing at lunchtime, and people do go out for drinks and they have events. It's interesting. If you look in the data, most people want to be hybrid. So just to give you some figures, 30% of employees want to be fully remote, 50% want to be hybrid, and 20% want to be fully in person. So there's a range of views. If you look at by age bin, what you find is young employees, so 20 to 29, are the most keen on coming in. So they still want to work from home typically 2 days a week, but they're very unkeen on being fully remote. And when you ask them, a lot of it's around mentoring and socialization. So I think what will happen, one prediction is if you look at Airbnb going fully remote, they're going to struggle a bit to hire 20-somethings. So I look at my students, I have many students coming out of Stanford, and the 20-somethings, the early 20-somethings are like, I want an office. I want a job where I go in, I have coworkers, I see people, I know better to go out for drinks and socialize and make friends and stuff. So they're mostly not that attracted to fully remote jobs. So I think you could see a bit of a reshuffling. I can imagine like 20-somethings go to Apple that's been more focused on the office, 30-somethings go to Airbnb, and that's not right or wrong. It's just going to change. It means basically your choice of fully remote versus hybrid affects your strategy, your recruitment, affects everything, your office holding. It's not an isolated decision. It's part of your bigger decision making.
What is your view on how this is going to change office space going forward? What do you have thoughts on that? Yeah,
it's pretty fascinating. So there are three, I'll broaden it out a bit. There are three real estate markets that have been hit by work from home. So the first is residential. Pretty much everyone owns or is renting a house or an apartment. So it turns out we've seen strong evidence of what's called the donut effect. So in big cities around the country, people don't want to live as much in the city centers anymore. They're moved out to the suburbs. It's like, if you're in San Francisco or New York, you're like, I don't need to be in downtown because I'm not going into work every day. And so what we've seen in Zillow data is a huge surge in rents and house prices out in the suburbs of big cities. And it's, it's softer in the center. Then you go to office space. Companies are so far not really reduced the demand for space much. When you talk to them, they're like, even with hybrid, it's hard to cut space that much because people are, are keeping office in the center, but they're coming in 3 days a week. But, it's hard to, you can't sublet on Monday and Friday.
Yeah, exactly.
But then if you look at rates that hold commercial office space, they've not done very well on the New York Stock Exchange. So the markets are predicting in the future we'll get smarter. We're going to use software. Like I work with, a couple of companies, Cadence and Scoop, that are very good at organizing companies to make better use of which days in and which days out. So in the long run, I think it's soft. The place where there's real pain even now is retail in city centers. So people are basically not buying, Starbucks in the center of cities nearly as much. They are spending it in the suburbs. So it's not like that spending's gone away. It's just shifted. So Starbucks in the city center is suffering, that kind of thing. And Starbucks in the suburbs is actually, selling out like crazy. So that's the biggest pain point is city center retail.
But do you think the configurations of offices and things like that will change? I mean, what do you think? I mean, will workspace change and things like that?
Yeah, Greg, exactly. So the big thing for most companies is not really, they're signing shorter leases. So they're very uncertain. They say, look, we don't know what the future holds. So we're going to shorten our lease. It's maybe a bit more expensive, but we'd like to pay for flexibility. The other thing, exactly as you say, is they're redesigning the space a bit. So there's less old-fashioned individual offices or less cubicle land, because when people come in, they're not really mainly focused now on the hybrid and working on their own quietly for hours on end. So that space has been cut back and it's been replaced by more meeting rooms, more kind of open plan, more like airport lounge seating area. So Richard, you're between meetings, you have half an hour between loads of events. It's great if you have something you can sit and work on your laptop, but it's kind of open, so I can walk by and say, hey, I've been meaning to, nice to see you, and we chat. And then also a bunch of Zoom cubicles. So like telephone booths, but basically set up because, as discussing earlier, if you're in San Francisco, you got to have a Zoom call with the Chicago office. You don't want to do it in somewhere. You don't need a whole meeting room, and you don't want to noise pollute an open plan area. So you're going to be pushed away into a little cubicle.
So companies like Apple, which I know is trying to get people, they built that, enormous, spaceship campus. They kind of got stuck with that, right? What are they going to do? They can't just abandon, I guess they could reconfigure the space, but I feel like they're sort of committed to using that space, aren't they?
I don't think it's such a problem. So first off, people work from home Monday, Friday. It's not like Apple has to pay more money for empty offices on Monday, Friday. If anything, they save a little bit on food and aircon and stuff. And their employees are happier. So allowing people to work from home on Monday, Friday. This is, it's very easy. I talk to a lot of people that talk about kind of the sunk cost fallacy. We bought it, we got to use it. That's not true. You're better off. Everyone's better off. You're correct that what you use it for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is more social time and less individual work time than you planned. They can probably tweak a bit at the edges. There is, some people, one of the problems actually, even harder is all these perspex screens. During the pandemic, you were going in exactly the wrong direction. So from 20 and 21, people were saying, when you come in, we want you to be in your own little bubble and not interact with others because you're infecting. And suddenly it's like a 180-degree turn in about summer 22, where most companies have said, the pandemic's more or less over. Our main focus now is not on keeping people apart because infection risk is getting them back together. So we're going to rip down all the screens. We're going to try and get rid of little cubicles and have you back out. But I think for most companies, reconfiguring space at the margin is not so costly. You can classically think of some offices, they may just be converted into small meeting rooms.
Let me go back to the question you touched on technology for a little bit. Do you see any technology on the horizon that could, again, like game changes? Like, for example, like I'm thinking of like Oculus VR. If Oculus VR glasses get to, $50, whatever, really cheap, although they're actually pretty cheap now, but then you and I could feel like we both had Oculus glasses. We could just meet, it'd be as if I was sitting next to you, like, what do you think? Do you see any technology that could game change this in a quantum way?
I could list stuff off. So I'm going to give you an anecdote to support how technology is definitely going to matter, but predicting which one is hard. It's like climate change. We know the world is getting hotter. We just don't know exactly which month and which hurricane is going to hit when. Yeah. So I was listening to a podcast by the guy that founded Dropbox, and it's really interesting. So he founded it, I'm trying to remember, it was about 2010. And he said, at the time he founded it, only techies had more than one laptop. It's like, who else needed this product? So he was aiming at techies. Right. Turns out that Dropbox and Zoom in some ways are the two most important pieces of technology for the pandemic. Because suddenly, broader video calls, think of Teams, etc. But really Zoom and Dropbox are the leaders in this space because A, you can share files, and B, we can have video calls. No one would have predicted this 5-6 years ago, either of them, how critical they would be. I think what's going to happen is the rate of technology is going to pick up stuff like, holograms, virtual reality, augmented reality. Better, I'm looking at you right now on a small laptop screen with a camera that's at the top, and it's kind of annoying because, to be honest, I've shrunk my Zoom screen so it's tiny, so it sits just below the camera. So when I look at you, we're looking at each other's eyes. It'd be much nicer if I could use the whole screen, but then I'll be looking, as far as you're concerned, it's not eye contact. So I think another thing that's going to happen is we're going to get very small cameras. We're going to put multiple ones across screens. You're going to use AI to make think of, if you watch a football match, they don't have one camera. They have, 10 cameras, including the blimp floating above it. But that's what we should do when we're having calls. And wherever I'm looking, it feels like you're in the room. So 5-10 years from now, that's going to be the way we are. So connecting like this, maybe it's 3D holograms. Now we're still going to want to meet in person. I can't touch, smell and touch is maybe, who knows? That's like science fiction, whether we get there, but it's going to make it easier. And at the margin, the other thing that's interesting, by the way, is regulation society. So another neighbor of mine, she's a doctor. She said pre-pandemic, you could never do telemedicine. There was
right.
Insurers wouldn't pay for it. States wouldn't didn't allow it. There's all kinds of barriers. That will, of course, evaporated within 2020. Now she goes in still 4 days a week, but 1 day a week she has telemedicine appointments, and a bunch of folks would much rather that. Like, if you're getting a test back or just need to speak for a repeat prescription or something minor,
I totally agree. It's that's exactly. It's so much easier. A lot of times it's exactly that. You just need a simple prescription, and exactly, just totally. Let me ask you. So this must be just a super exciting time for you. I just can't imagine. Everybody wants. It must be so fascinating. You've been studying this for what have you said, 20 years. And now and now your topic is relevant to everyone. Everyone wants to talk to you about it. It must just be a really exciting time to be, in this field.
Yeah, certainly. I'm aware. in a year's time, I keep saying to my friends and, wife and kids, it will quieten down. It doesn't seem to have quietened down yet. Yeah, it's like being, a volcanologist. I've forgotten the exact word, but, a volcano goes off and then, it quietens down and the world moves on. Yeah, I mean, partly I've made a huge focus on it. With March 2020 happened. I had some research. To be quite blunt, there was so little research on work from home pre-pandemic. I was looking at organizing a conference. I couldn't even find enough paper, so I just gave up. So it's like nobody was really looking at it. What there was tended to be as an academic, what I'm kind of skeptical of. You go out and survey a bunch of people and say, what do you think? And they all say it's great. And then you'd write a paper saying it's great. And it's like, it's not really very, scientific. You really want either rigorous data collection or like a randomized control. So it was just pretty thin, and what there was often very biased. It was like you'd look at the paper and you'd discover it was funded by AT&T. Like, I wonder what view they have on remote. So then in March 2020, I just thought, well, look, this is clearly it. As an academic, if you're not going to work on it now and try and do something that's helpful, when are you going to do this? So at that point, I shifted from honestly 3-4% of my time to probably 70-80% of my time. So a lot of it is stuff that's like really interesting, and it feels really positive. Like I talk, as a random example, my local city council, a bunch of hospitals, Concern, which is a charity in Ireland I've been talking to a bunch, the UN World Food Program, these kind of things. You think like you're having real impact, you can really help people out. I've spoken to 2 different national labs. I'm sure the world will settle down. I'm giving a talk today at an event. It's Myron Scholes, as in Black Scholes, his 80th birthday. He's having an event. It's really sweet. And there's like 6 people talking about their books, and I'm the only one that doesn't have a book. And work from home is changing so fast. It's not yet possible to really write a book. It's kind of like writing a book about a Super Bowl at the halftime. But I think a year or 2 from now, life will have settled down. We'll be in a new normal. We'll get a good sense of where we are. And, my phone will stop ringing. My email volume will, and I'll go back to writing papers that 2 people will read. But right now, it is busy. And I mean, it's amazing for me getting to talk also to a lot of very senior execs, because this is such a big decision. Like hybrid, remote, in person affects everything. So it's really a CO, CPO type decision, CHR. So I've ended up interacting at that level, which is not something I really did pre-pandemic. And I doubt 3-4 years from now, I'll probably go back to, that not being my focus.
Yeah. Well, Nick, it's been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. It's so fascinating to talk to you. When you do decide to write that book, or when you write it, please come back and tell me about it.
Richard, hey, thanks very much, and great to catch up too.
This is Richard Hsu and Nick Bloom. Bye.